Sustainability and ESG at Forest Investment Associates. I'm going to be helping to moderate this panel today, really diving deeply into the idea of nature metrics, biodiversity metrics, and accounting for nature. How and why and where is that field going? To be honest, when we did our prep for this panel, we thought there was going to be so much chatter on day one about what businesses are doing to measure and account for nature. My reflections from yesterday is I heard a lot of interest in biodiversity and nature, but we actually didn't get super into those details, which is good because we haven't shortcut the guys on the stage today who have some really specific and interesting examples to share with us, as well as a really strong background from a variety of perspectives here. So really pleased to have this great panel with us. I'm going to try and go from this direction to this direction here. We have with us Richard Iliffe, who is the MRV manager at the Gold Standard. Folks are probably very familiar with the Gold Standard, so welcome, Richard. We also have, Ian Brettell, biodiversity policy officer at the Crowther Lab, one of the coolest combinations of personal backgrounds. Studied the law, then did a PhD in genetics, and now works in biodiversity policy, which is like a very special and cool background and shows you what this field is all about. Next to him, we have Axel Rossberg, who is a theoretical ecologist at Queen Mary College. Thanks for joining us, Axel. And last but not least, we have Paul Smith, who is the Secretary General or CEO of Botanic Gardens Conservation Society International. Great. So we're going to be guiding you through the next 40 or so minutes into biodiversity and nature. Look, there's many reasons to kick off this morning with a session on this. By now, there are hundreds and hopefully thousands of corporations and many investors behind them and supporting them who are trying to figure out how to account for biodiversity in nature, how to monetize it, how to value it, how to not harm it, how to understand what our interactions are with it. We've got the idea of nature positive, which also came up a few times yesterday and maybe didn't get quite defined. There's a lot of questions around what this means in practice. And this panel is really going to help us look at some of the topics like the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, TNFD, maybe touch on concepts like the Global Biodiversity Framework if we can, and others to help us understand the drive for these matters, but also what's the scientific foundation for moving forward in them. So our aims as we set out as a group, just to share with you all so you can help keep us accountable, please. Exploring some of the tensions between meaningful and precise data on the one hand, and pragmatic and implementable solutions on the other. If you know me, you know, it's a big tension for me measuring nature. Been asked to do it for a decade, and a lot of the times we just hear, well, how many hectares do you have? Are they certified? What happens there? So how do we get past that, but without having just unreasonable demands for data or things that are hard to collect or understand? Our second aim is to use real examples and really talk about real outcomes from the ground, keeping the conversation focused on conservation that's actionable, focused on real-world outcomes, and ultimately getting to implementable approaches so that when we're meeting next year or the following year, we'll have more of these real-world outcomes and examples to share with each other. So with that, I'll stop yammering at you. I'm going to turn it over to you first, Richard, if that's okay. Folks are going to introduce themselves a little bit further. But I'm just wondering, Richard, if you could explain to us from your background at the Gold Standard, which I think many of the audience are familiar with, and we had a lot of conversation about carbon markets yesterday. Can you share what you're doing there at the Gold Standard in relation to transitioning from carbon markets and potentially nature measurement and maybe even markets?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose I will start with carbon because that's what we're best known for. So we are, as you might expect, extremely busy working on topics related to nature. So with the carbon focus, we have, I think, maybe about 21 methodologies under development. I cannot remember them all, but I would say the key themes are soil organic carbon. So we have some methodologies on grassland, crop residue, blue carbon, so mangroves, sargassum and kelp sequestration, rice wetting, alternate wetting. You can imagine there's quite a big impact there, considering how much rice has grown, and FICO remediation, which was something that really piqued my interest. So that's what we're looking at from the carbon side. Nature, and specifically biodiversity. What we're doing is really an exploratory phase. Obviously, there's lots of stuff out there on biodiversity, and it's quite a noisy space. We don't want to add to that noise. So we're just basically looking at what metrics are out there. We're focusing on publicly available stuff. looking to see what it can enable in terms of claims. And then at the same time, we've recently hired a consultant to help us understand what investors and what corporates might want to claim vis-a-vis biodiversity and things like global, the GBF, much easier to say, TNFD, these types of frameworks that kind of drive target setting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
While we're on the acronyms, just in case there's folks with us who don't know, you focus on MRV. What is that, and how's that relevant to nature conversation?
Yeah, sure. MRV is monitoring, reporting, and verification.
Okay.
So hopefully that's straightforward. Yeah.
Hope so. Okay, great. I might pass to the far end over to you, Paul. One of the things that struck me in our conversation was just how many collaborations you've got going underway and the many things your organization's up to. So if you could introduce yourself, the organization a little bit, and what you're doing around nature metrics.
Sure. Yeah, BGCI is easier to say than Botanic Gardens Conservation International, but BGCI is the largest plant conservation network in the world. We have about 800 member organizations. Kew, Missouri, you'll have heard of many of them, but also many botanical institutions in developing countries and in biodiversity hotspots. And our major concern is the extinction crisis. It's this is a big part of the global biodiversity framework, unlike the previous HE targets, is about restoration, recovery, and the opportunity to incorporate recovery and restoration into the way that we manage land. So about a year and a half ago, we published the State of the World's Trees report, which is based on a red list assessment of all of the world's 58,500 tree species. And at that point, and we're still partly through it, although we have information for about 92% of all tree species, a third of them, 17,500 species, are threatened with extinction. We have over 450 species that are down to fewer than 50 individuals left in the wild. Now, trees are keystone species, so if you plant an oak tree here, you're supporting literally thousands of other species in biodiversity, lichens, fungi, insects, mammals, and so on. So there's a big knock-on for all of biodiversity if you recover a keystone tree species. And that's what we're primarily interested in. We have a network who've been involved in tree species recovery for the last 15 years. We have frameworks for measuring that accurately, and we'd like to get that incorporated into restoration initiatives, biodiversity credits, and so on.
That's super interesting. Just curious, where is that kind of data coming from to get something so specific, the number of trees where there's fewer than 50 left in the world? How do we even know that? What work's being done to get us to that knowledge?
Well, if you're familiar with the IUCN Red List system, that's based on specialist groups and Red List authorities all around the world. So it's devolved. And so if you take Mauritius, for example, they have their own Red List authority for the mascarenes in that area. And there are 54 critically endangered tree species on Mauritius and Rodrigues alone. They know their own biodiversity, and they're the ones that carry out the assessments.
That's incredible. All right, we're going to turn to the center stage here, and I'm glad that you've sat yourselves in this configuration, because in the middle we have two solutions, two different solutions, not to solve the extinction crisis, but to help us understand the impact that we're having on biodiversity and nature. So I think if I can, I'm going to pass it over to you, Ian, to tell us what Crowther Lab is doing around mapping for biodiversity.
Sure. So just to give you a little bit of background to the lab, it's a scientific research group based at the University ETH Zurich in Switzerland. And the group is composed of ecologists and data scientists and remote sensing experts who are all driven to answer fundamental questions about ecology and the interaction between biodiversity and climate change. And so the approach that we tend to use for a lot of our research in the lab is to start with these vast databases of ground-sourced information that's been collected across the globe, and then to use advanced machine learning and AI approaches to correlate those ground-source data with environmental variables like temperature and precipitation and geology, but then also satellite imagery to then create a global map that can tell you for every terrestrial location on Earth what is there now, or is likely to be there now, and what is likely to, what would have been there if that area was subjected to minimal human disturbance. And so, using this approach, the leader of our group, Tom Crowther, his first big paper was to count the number of trees on Earth. How many trees are there on Earth? And his final figure was just over 3 trillion, which is 8 times more than the previous estimate of 400 billion. Sorry, eight times more than the previous estimate of 400 billion. And so the next question that he came up with was, well, okay, if there are 3 trillion trees on Earth, how big is the area on Earth, if you excluded all agriculture and urban areas, how much degraded land is there that otherwise would be a forest? How many trees could you plant there, and how much carbon would that sequester? And it turns out that across the world, there's an area about the size of Brazil of degraded land that would otherwise be a forest, and that would host 1 trillion trees in addition to the existing 3 trillion. And if those forests were restored and allowed to mature in perpetuity, those forests would sequester an amount of carbon equivalent to 1/3 of all carbon emitted by human activities over the course of history. So 1/3 of all anthropogenic emissions. And so that demonstrated the huge potential that ecosystem restoration has as a weapon against climate change. But it was misconstrued, and the finding blew up, and it brought this topic into mainstream conversations, but it was misconstrued. At no point did the paper say we should plant 1 trillion trees. It was taken as a call to plant vast monocultures of fast-growing species, and that really was not what was intended, and because what we really should be doing is restoring fully functioning natural ecosystems. And so that brings me to the lab's latest initiative. It's called the Seed Biocomplexity Index. And it's a metric that can measure how biodiversity changes over time for every 30 by 30 meter pixel on Earth. And so the way that it works is we start with the hundreds of global ecological data layers that have been published in the academic literature. We put them together and correlate them with satellite imagery to get the read of its changes over time, and it'll ingest emerging ground source data sources to validate and increase the accuracy of the metric, like eDNA and bioacoustics and low-flying drone data. And so the ultimate goal of the biocomplexity index, and the reason that it's framed like that, is to optimize for the complexity of the whole system to avoid the perverse outcomes that occur when optimizing for just a single component of nature, like carbon or species richness. And so seed's ready to be released in September this year, and at that point it can be used by countries to measure their progress towards their targets under the Global Biodiversity Framework. It'll help businesses understand where they're impacting nature and to what extent, and how they might mitigate that damage through the frameworks like TNFD and SBTN, Science-Based Targets Network. And then around this metric, you can also start to build biodiversity credit systems or other mechanisms for internalizing nature into our economic systems, so that it costs a lot more to do anything that degrades it and can generate some income for anything that restores it.
That's amazing. So September, we should stay tuned for the release of that. I didn't realize that Crowther Lab was the ones behind the 3 trillion number. I don't know if other people get asked this question if you work related to forestry, but I get asked like twice a year by random friends and people, how many trees are on the planet? I say 3 trillion, and so now I know where that comes from, which is great. So from very basic data through to applying that to real world ideas like restoration, very cool stuff. And Axel, I'm gonna leave it just to you to just explain to us about your thing that you're ready to pilot, which is pretty exciting.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, to start, let me pick up from something that Paul said. It's the extinction crisis. It's not the ecosystem service crisis. It's not called the natural capital crisis, it's extinction crisis. And the term biodiversity itself, when it was coined in the 1980s, people were worried about extinction of species. That is all that really matters. And that's still what matters now to scientists. And that's what matters to the public. And that's, I think, where the transition risk comes from. So that's the problem we have to think about, extinction risk. Yesterday, when we were meeting, one species went extinct, statistically speaking. Today, another one will go extinct. And it should be only around one per year. Okay, so that's the problem. And the good thing is there is a solution. If you really say, okay, my interest is only in extinction risk, then the problem becomes much easier. You can model extinction risk, and from such models you can derive a metric of impact on extinction risk. What is the impact of some forestry, some organization on extinction risk? And here's the answer. You ask yourself, for a species, how many % did I contribute through my action to the global population of that species? You add this for all species, for example, for all tree species. That's your metric. And it sounds simple, because that's the nice thing about it. There is some deeper theory behind it, which I won't explain you now today. And this metric we call the biodiversity impact credits, because you can use them as credits for the things you did. And if the population of species decline, then you get negative credits, while if you increase population of species, particularly rare species, you get positive credits. So, and that's the metric, and it's here. So we don't have a launch date for the metric, because it was there already. It comes out of mathematics. When I wrote down the formula, it was there. What we need now are methodologies to measure this, and that's what we're launching today. So there's a little PDF file which describes how to calculate this metric, for example, at the level of individual trees, or at the level of a corporate portfolio. And I try to make it very simple, so just to get you kind of used to looking at it, play with it. And it's available in the little box in your mobile phone app. There's a little box for our session, and there will be a link, and if you can't find that, you simply go to biodiversitycredits.info, and it will immediately pop up. And yes, I want you to look at this and play with it, and then tell me what you think about it, if it works for you.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you. Some sobering facts in there, and I appreciate that it's a bit of a challenging way to start some of the conversations, but when I hear things like there are solutions, if we think about the emission side, to literally undo a third of all the harm we've done, it makes me hopeful to think that we're approaching how we can not only slow the loss of nature, but really get to that point of reversing the loss of nature. And if I think about the term nature positive, I don't know if we really defined it yesterday, but let's loosely say it's that, going from a decline and loss of nature back to where we're actively recovering nature. I'm going to ask a quick audience participation question or two, if y'all don't mind. Limber up for us. Don't worry, you're not going to hokey pokey. How many of you would say today, put your hands up if yes, that you are already involved with investments that aim for nature positive outcomes? Great, thank you. That's good. You can keep them up if you put them up, please. How many of you are measuring the impacts on nature in those projects? Most. Okay, so a few came down, which is good. Some honesty. Now, for how many of those whose hands are still up, so you're involved in nature positive investments, you're measuring your impacts on nature, for how many of those was nature part of the investment driver and thesis from a financial perspective? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like around 10, 11, maybe 12. Okay, and a couple of those are from the same organization, so we'll round down to 10-ish. Okay. So there's some positive signs of folks who are actively and already investing in nature, which is good, but a lot of us had to put our hands down when it came to both measurement and especially to the investment driver side. So there's still some progress to be made here. Paul, I think you've got some really great thoughts on that differentiation between extinction crisis and the complication. One of the things that we feel is it gets so hard and overwhelming to say, I'm going to reverse the loss of nature. How do I do that? How do I measure it? How do I monetize it if that's my objective? What are some of your thoughts around that topic?
Well, I think the keep it simple is really important. We know that biodiversity is complex and it's context specific, it's site specific, and so on. But I think it is possible to come up with measures and metrics which do all of those things, are site specific and take into account socioeconomic context and all of those things. so there's a number of, in the biodiversity credit discussions, you'll be aware, I'm sure, that there are a number of methodologies out there, including baskets of biodiversity. Our view is that why make it that complicated? I think one of the constraints there is finding the expertise across the taxonomic array to measure change. So what we're proposing is, and again this is around extinction risk, is that if you are supporting the recovery of a single tree species, a keystone species, which, as I say, has a knock-on for a whole ecosystem and other biodiversity that relies on that, that is much simpler to measure. And actually, the beauty of what Axel is proposing is that the fewer there are of that particular, fewer individuals there are of that particular species, the bigger the impact you can make. Because we're talking about tree species that are down to fewer than 50 individuals. It's not that big a deal to double that, to treble that, and so on. So as a biodiversity credit, you're getting credit for doing that, for taking that recovery. And it's easy to measure. We've been doing this for many years. These are bona fide botanical institutions, the biggest, the best in the world. They know how to measure that. And it can be as simple as the number of individuals. It is slightly more complicated than that, but it is relatively simple. And why start complicated would be my question. Why go to complicated parts of the world? Why start with complications? Let's start with a package that is already there. We know which tree species there are. We have experts who already know how to grow those tree species, how to recover them, and so on, and work with packages like that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we saw yesterday with carbon markets that the search for the perfect has definitely become the enemy of the good, and that's something we really all need to be mindful to avoid. Axel, with this in mind, going from the theoretical concepts that you've developed and defined, you've got a cool opportunity set here. You've got project developers who are hungry for new ideas. You've got some investment decision makers in the room. You've got capital allocators. How do we get to decision-useful information around biodiversity? What does that look like?
Okay, so I think that the first thing is you want the metric you use and your decisions should be based on the science, and they should link to the global objectives, like the Global Biodiversity Framework. And one of the objectives of the Global Biodiversity Framework is to reduce extinction risk. That's written there. Yes, so the science tells you what the metric is, like in CO2. The science tells you have to reduce CO2. And then you start thinking about methodologies and how to measure it, and there are various ways of approaching it. And that's the same with the biodiversity impact credits. Whatever methodology you use to determine them, to estimate them, they are linked to the science. They give you the credits in a convertible metric. If you do it at corporate level, at the level of an individual tree species, you can combine them. That makes it useful. The other way in which a metric can be meaningful and useful is that it's so simple that you understand it and you know what you have to do. The metric, you can look at the metric and say, oh yeah, in order to increase this metric, that's what I have to do. And that's why we are happy I came up with this very simple formula. And finally, I think for a decision maker, it's important that what the metric tells them to do actually makes intuitive sense. You wouldn't make a big decision if what the metric tells you no, I can't really. It sounds like cheating, looks like cheating. In the case of biodiversity impact credits, you can't really cheat. Whatever you come up with to increase the value of this metric is good for biodiversity. It reduces extinction risk. It's just a line, and you see it. And the most obvious thing to do is to preserve a single tree species. That gives you lots of credits for rather small investment. And finally, useful, you want the metric to be useful to optimize your decision making. And in the case of biodiversity impact credits, one can show that if we all try to get as many credits as possible, we automatically, as a collective, optimize allocation of resources to biodiversity conservation. They're automatically optimizing what we're doing to stop species from going extinct. And that's a great thing.
Yeah, thanks, Axel. You said can't cheat, and those words really stuck with me there for
Yeah.
a second. And we're living in a world where we're very afraid of greenwashing for good reason, and where that fear is often, I think, preventing capital from flowing. So one of the keys to that, we chatted about this the other day, is having the standards and assurance behind it that give people faith in the credibility of projects. One thing that I think Gold Standard's been able to do excellently is really integrate co-benefits into carbon. Have you seen, Richard, from your perspective there, any actual change in nature by the inclusion of those co-benefits and SDG impacts in the Gold Standard, or is it just giving us more information? Are things changing, or are we just knowing more?
I think it's a little bit of both. The more people do nature projects, the more we learn about them, I would say. And it just stimulates innovation, I would say. I mean, harking back to what I said at the start, there's been an explosion in new methodology ideas coming to Gold Standard because of the immense interest in nature, because people are seeing changes, they're seeing new activities and projects, and they want to do more. So it's a little bit of both. I'm just trying to think.
Is there like a particular, anything that comes to mind for a project with a co-benefit where you saw like the SDG impact tags being very helpful to understand the project and what it was doing on the ground?
I would say so. It helps with the story because ultimately people invest in carbon credit projects because they obviously use that credit as part of their sustainability strategy, and the story behind it is important. I mean, SDG 15 has been an important SDG that people have used in Gold Standard.
Yeah, life on land.
Yeah, life on land.
Yeah, great. My second favorite SDG.
What's your favorite?
12. Sustainable consumption and production. Yeah. Wood. It's good. No, that's great. Okay, we have a little smile going on. We need some energy, so if you gotta send some vibes around. Ian, I think one of the things that's super cool about your mapping is that it is helping us to see some of these changes over time, right? It is something that can be used for investors to understand the difference between intact and modified habitats and what it's like as a spectrum across those things. What advice would you give for investors who are wanting to understand and monitor impact over time while trying to keep it simple? Because the range of investors who are putting money into these things, they've got whole portfolios to look at. They don't know how would we know the difference between the Atlantic forest versus the Bornean rainforest versus the Sahara? Like, what do we do? How can we monitor?
Yeah, I should have clarified that by complexity, complex doesn't necessarily equate to complicated. So we're reducing all of these layers down to a single number between 0 and 1, an index, 0 to 1. Yeah. That's globally standardized, but based on only comparing like against like. So the location that you're interested in, it's going to have a value as it is now, and then it'll have a value as it would be under the current climatic conditions, but as it would be if it were natural and restored. And then the difference between those two shapes, the concept is a nonagon. The difference between those shapes will give you that value between 0 and 1. So you can compare the index between locations, but the values are still location specific. And obviously a key part of this whole natural complexity measurement is bringing back these natural species. And so Axel's metric is would be perfect to integrate into seed, and we were discussing that just before the meeting. So the way that once seed is released in September, it's going to be hosted on our affiliated platform Restore, R-E-S-T-O-R. And the website's restore.eco, and I encourage you to all check it out. It's very cool. But it was basically envisaged as a Google Maps for ecosystem restoration. So instead of seeing shops and cafes, you get ecosystem conservation and restoration projects, and you can click into them and you can get all the data that's been discovered and monitored for that area. As a user, you can quickly just click on a map to create your polygon of the area that you're restoring and get all of this information about which species should be planted there, which nurseries you could be connected to, and eventually which funders you can fund as well. And so once seeds built in there, you'll have a measure of the changes in biocomplexity for each of those 140,000 projects and counting over time. And then you can decompose the index and look at specific indexes like Axel's. So the idea is to make it as transparent as possible.
Transparent. It sounds like very accessible where anyone can
Exactly.
use it and understand what they're looking at, which is great. I think pivoting just a little bit, a topic that came up yesterday that I think this panel can expand on in a new direction. There's the idea that natural capital might feel quite new. There's a lot of rising energy, big announcements, big ideas and ambitions. We were saying carbon's not new. We've had carbon markets since the 90s. Someone said nature's much later. Mitigation banking's been around a lot longer than that. Environmental markets aren't new. They're still not perfect, and they're still not at the scale that any of us want them to be. Paul, from your role with BGCI, can you share a little bit about what you think has gone well or poorly from the ecosystem services side of things that we can leverage to really accelerate as we look into addressing the extinction crisis?
Sure. Well, when we talk about natural capital, nature-based solutions, forest landscape restoration, and so on, you're dealing with a whole different set of variables, criteria. So natural capital accounting, of course, biodiversity is one of those, carbon is one of those. You've got recreational value, you've got aesthetic value, you've got jobs, economic value, you've got all of those things bundled into one. And it can be difficult to see the wood for the trees with much of what is dressed up as nature-based solutions. And I think from our perspective, it's biodiversity that often loses out. You can deliver ecosystem services, better water, erosion control, productivity and so on, without necessarily improving biodiversity. So we actually have tried to start to tackle this because there's huge interest in tree planting, restoration, that whole gamut from agroforestry right the way through to ecological restoration. But we don't often know what the impacts are on biodiversity. And the biggest danger is that we displace biodiversity inadvertently. We might be planting a monoculture, we might be planting something that aims for biodiversity outcomes, but actually, because we don't know what's there in the first place, we're displacing that. So we set up this global biodiversity standard that you can go online and look at. It's just biodiversitystandard.org, which is funded by UK Overseas Development, actually, to set up hubs in 6 megabiodiverse countries, Brazil, India, Peru, etc., whose job is to assess biodiversity impacts of this whole gamut of nature-based solutions projects. Are they positive? Are they inadvertently negative? And most importantly, what can we do to make them more positive? There's a mentoring element to this as well. It's not a, you guys fail, you're out kind of thing. And that's why it's really important that these hubs are technical organizations who are involved in biodiverse ecological restoration. They're local organizations, they know their own biodiversity, their own social economic context. They have data that is not available to international consultants using global data sets. And that way, we're looking at risk. You can measure risk there if you're inadvertently causing problems for biodiversity, but also create opportunity to get better biodiversity outcomes in that local. And that's the bit that's been missing, I think, because anybody can call their project a nature-based solution project.
Yeah, and with that, it's important for folks to know there is a standard for nature-based solutions as well. IUCN has put one out, which is a really good reference to look at if you want to think about using the term credibly and whether or not you agree with that definition. They've got a great one to, I think.
They do, and I think, there are a lot of principles out there, which are great, but they need to be verified by an independent third party, and that's often what's missing. Yeah.
Yes, great.
Biodiversity as well as carbon. Yeah.
Agree. That having that assurance is an integral part of the credibility story, de-risking reputation, all of that. On the reputation thing, I think we'll ask folks a question about reputation in a minute. We're just around 10 minutes, and so I've been asked to make sure that we get some Q&A involved here, so start firing up some Q&A if you've got, and Haley will need the mic in a second. But while we're doing that, let's ask the audience some more questions. So from what we've heard today, how many of you think that nature recovery already has meaningful and scaled opportunities as a business model, as a driver of investment decisions? Is it out there today? We had 10 groups that are already investing in it. Are there more of you who think it's real and there's a real business model behind it? It's a hand-raising exercise again. Ooh, ouch. Okay, we might need to start over the panel. Okay, well, how many of you think that those business models, we thought you might not be totally on board, how many think that these are going to emerge over the next, I'm going to push it out, originally said 1 to 3 years, but I'll say 3 to 5 years, we'll see business models emerge. Oh, thank gosh. Okay, great, good. All right, who's still skeptical? How many of you think that biodiversity and nature addressing the extinction crisis is still going to fall into more of a corporate social responsibility or public relations exercise and play? Yeah, it's definitely where a lot of it is today. It might stay there for a while, but let's hope not, with better, simpler, easier to use metrics. Okay, well, so I think that's good. We had some conversions, I think, of people who see on the horizon that we're getting there. I'm gonna ask for some quick answers to this so that we can do the audience questions. I'm gonna ask each of you if you can say, what do you think it's really gonna take to make it all real? So we said 3 to 5 years, we got more than half the hands up. Let's try and bring that forward to 2 to 3 years. We're gonna have actionable business models on the ground. Ian, what's that going to take from a policy perspective? Quickly.
Yeah, I think governments are going to have to step up. They have a huge role to play. They'll need to mandate the TNFD, so that, I mean, it's a business-led initiative. They're telling governments how they want to be regulated. They just want to be all playing on the same field. So it's up to governments to just implement. That shouldn't be too hard. There's also a new movement to looking at sustainability-linked sovereign debt. So where developing countries can reduce the debt that they owe to developed countries by demonstrating provable gains in biodiversity in those areas. So both of those are somewhat promising, but there's another movement that's gaining a lot of momentum, and it's called the degrowth movement. There was even a degrowth conference in the European Parliament at the end of last week, and it's based on the premise that this concept of perpetual growth is just simply incompatible with our ability to remain within our planetary boundaries. And so it's becoming increasingly apparent that maybe the only way out of this mess is to change the system.
More sobering advice. Okay. Well, I think just because we have 5 minutes on the clock, if one of the other 3 of you wants to address that question, what will it take to accelerate the business models?
Yeah, what does it take? I think we are there. I just looked, there are so many different organizations that want to become biodiversity positive. We know how to assess biodiversity impacts, footprints of organizations for extinction risk. We know how to generate credits to overcome this. You can end up in a positive value. It's entirely feasible. Just get cracking.
I like
That's all
that.
we need to do. Yeah.
Fewer conferences, more action on the ground, yeah?
Exactly.
No, sorry, Haley. We'll still have 1 conference a year. Okay, questions? Anyone have a question for the panel? Got a question from Ross Hampton. I'm saving
Hello,
time.
everyone. Terrific panel. Ross Hampton. I'm here in a number of capacities, but particularly today, FAO Chair of the Advisory Committee on Sustainable Forest-Based Industries. And this is a topic that is so important to get right. And at FAO, we're very concerned. I think, Axel, this is probably for you. The whole phenomenon of pressing down in one place and putting pressure up elsewhere is of great concern to us. Everyone agrees that we need to do more in this area. But how do you, and you must be dealing with this in your work, how do you ensure that moving incrementally toward better biodiversity outcomes in global north countries doesn't perversely reduce outcomes in other places? In Australia, for example, where I come from, we have some governments who are deciding we shouldn't be doing forestry in our natural forests, our hardwood forests, and they're going to stop that, but we're going to increase our demand for hardwood over the next 10 or 15 years fourfold in Australia. So when we join the dots at FAO, we think, well, that's rainforest timber. So you must grapple with this. In fact,
Yes,
all the
that's an
panels-
excellent question, and it comes down to the point: can we cheat the metric? Well, you can't, because most of these biodiversity impact credits that you can generate are located in biodiversity hotspots. So if you cut down a forest in Germany, it doesn't have much an impact. But if you do it in Peru, it's a big thing, and so automatically it focuses the minds to do it in a way that it protects biodiversity.
Absolutely. We got time for one more question.
So, apologies, another Australian voice. A question to Axel and perhaps Paul. I want to test a cheat on you.
Okay.
I love the idea of increasing the global population of a species and being rewarded for that. But you can do that by doing that in nurseries or in botanical gardens. It helps the botanical gardens and nurseries, but it doesn't help nature necessarily. How do we get around that, and how do we invest in the whole system of natural habitat? How do we invest in gamma diversity, in connectivity, and so on, so that we really are repairing the fabric of nature?
Let me answer part of it, and then I'll leave the other part to Paul. So, first of all, the metric is all about gamma diversity. It's only about global diversity. And then you ask, so how about the system and all these connections? And shouldn't we kind of keep in mind and the complexity of ecosystems? And we know the global economy is a very complex thing, lots of connections, interactions. The Dow Jones Index is not. It's very simple. It's just a weighted average. And that by this end, but still, it tells you something about the global economy. And that's the same with this metric. Now, the question, shall we count the trees in nurseries or not, that I'll leave to.
No is the answer. What we're looking for is species that are back in the landscape, and ideally, well, you'll know from Australia, I mean, it gets more complicated when you have to translocate species, perhaps due to dieback or whatever. So they're not necessarily going back where they were, but they are self-perpetuating in that landscape, and there are knock-on benefits for biodiversity. So ideally, they're going back into original habitats. That's not always possible, but that the understanding is that these are not ex situ collections. They're not sitting in seed banks or botanic gardens. That's the means to the end in some cases.
I think getting back to that point, if we want to see real action on the ground, we want to see these things making a functional difference, that species contribute to the ecosystem services and not just from one way or the other. Well, gosh, I feel a little bit remiss because we had a lot of topics that we didn't get to touch on today, and I'm going to throw a spanner in the works. Sorry, that's the phrase I learned in Australia. We say a wrench in the works in the States. So the spanner's coming your way. What did we not talk about that we should have talked about today to solve and address biodiversity? What's the one topic that you would say? And here's examples: partner, invest, innovate, fail, try again. What do we need to be addressing and willing to do?
I think value chains, it's really, really important that we work with local expertise and local infrastructures when it comes to biodiversity, because it is, as I say, site-specific, context-specific. People know their own biodiversity. The expertise is out there. There's a cultural challenge with deploying that expertise, but really we need to be engaging them as opposed to the top-down approach where we fly in consultants from who knows where.
Yeah. Axel, what did we leave out of the conversation today?
We had all the right topics. In the old days, people often talked about biodiversity offsetting, and they had these kind of this planned economy kind of thinking, the communist kind of thing. Well, we do all these things, and then great things will happen. And I think looking at simple metrics, we move away from this, and we just look at what's there right now, and this counts.
Yep. Ian, for you, a missing piece of the conversation?
I think Indigenous peoples and local communities should be mentioned. So our theory of change is that we need to make nature the economic choice for people, and part of that is facilitating the flow of capital back to these communities to help them steward the ecosystems that they're so familiar with back to health. And so, I think our view is that that's a core part of the solution. It's the only way to get the scale and speed that's required to fix this.
Yeah, and Richard, last words.
Yeah, I think related to Ian, kind of cracking the business case really, because the current state of play is certain actors have too much power, and it's about rebalancing that and you know, making nature more valuable to save than to destroy.
Absolutely. And thank you to all of you, especially thank you for bringing up people. That was the word I circled here of what we left out today. And that is the value of the conferences. We've got so much human capital in this room ready to address biodiversity and nature problems. So I am not going to belittle conferences, and I will especially say next coffee break, please, let's talk about how to partner, invest, innovate, try what we can do together. So thank you to the panelists. Thanks for joining us this morning.